Hi, and welcome to the Uplift with Dabney Brice, the podcast where we'll elevate global stories by shining a spotlight on underrepresented narratives, educating ourselves about current and historical events and diverse cultures and communities. Let's journey together to step outside our comfort zones, uplift each other, and make the world a little bit better along the way. Welcome, my uplifters. It's your girl, Dabney Brice. Today, we're going to be talking about maternal health with Cecelia Lim, who is a registered nurse working with babies and parents in the NICU at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We talk about what midwives and doulas are and the difference between them. We also get into the gaps in our healthcare system when it comes to maternal health pre, during, and after birth. This was such an eye-opening and informative conversation, and I really enjoyed this conversation, and I could not wait for y'all to hear it. So I hope y'all enjoy it, and let's dive in and let's get started. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Cecelia. I'm really happy to have you on. And you're a very special guest because you're my first guest who I didn't really know like prior to the interview. I know we've like seen each other in passing. We have mutual friends. Our mutual friend Jess, she's the one that told me amazing things about you and was like, you should have her on. And I was like, yeah, of course. So yeah, I'm really excited to have you, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course. Well, to start off, especially since I don't really know you that well and our listeners don't know you either, can you tell us a bit about who you are and your background?
Yeah. Well, my name's Cecelia. I use she, her pronouns. I currently live in Philadelphia, though I grew up in the Delaware area.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
I am a registered nurse, so that's like, I feel like the most defining part about me right now. I just graduated from University of Delaware's accelerated nursing program last winter.
Oh, congratulations. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I moved to Philly over the summer, and so yeah, I also got my Bachelor of Arts in Women and Gender Studies from Smith College, so that was my first degree,
Mm,
and that's an all women's college in Massachusetts,
mm-hmm. Nice.
and it's yeah, it was a really defining place for me to be. I think it just really influenced me to go into nursing and shaped how I view like reproductive health care and
Mm-hmm.
reproductive justice. So those are just some things that I'm really passionate about. Um, I also very strongly identify as a queer Asian American woman. I'm Korean and Chinese, and yeah, my family is super important to me. Um, and yeah, I'm also a dancer, so I feel like those
Ooh,
are
that's funny
the
because Jess told me that. And I have a question later on about dance because I also was a dancer growing up. So I love meeting other dancers because it's just like we get each
yeah.
other. So I have a question about that later on, but thank you so much for sharing all of that about yourself. Again, you've mentioned that you're a registered nurse, and you've told me that you work in the NICU with babies and parents at the hospital that you work at. And I would love to know, how long have you been working there?
So I just started last May, so it's been a little over a year.
Nice.
Yeah, so I work in the NICU at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia.
Mm,
Call it the Newborn and Infant Intensive Care Unit. So I take care of babies that are born prematurely as young as 23 weeks gestation, all the way up until they're around a year of age.
wow.
And yeah, so it's quite a range because the babies they come into us usually pretty sick. We're
Mm-hmm.
like considered a level 4 NICU, which means that we can provide some of like the highest level of care and interventions.
Wow. And that's interesting that you mentioned like 23 weeks to a year, because I feel like whenever anyone talks about like NICU and babies, they just talk about like premature babies, and like you work with babies even after, like
Yeah.
after birth, I guess they're growing into like they're growing older. So that's really interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, we usually actually see babies that come to us from other hospitals.
Mm.
There is a delivery unit at the hospital, so some parents do give birth there, and we do get the babies directly after they're born. But oftentimes, we get babies that are transferred over because they were born somewhere else, and then they became really sick or they needed really higher levels of care, so
Hmm.
then they transfer to us. Um, but yeah, it is quite a range. And
Yeah.
at that age, it sounds like it's not that long, like, oh, just like up to a year old.
Hmm.
But each week, the babies, they grow so much and they change so much just in a matter of like days. So it is quite the variety of disorders that we see and types of patients.
Yeah, and the first year of a baby's life is so monumental, so that makes complete sense. So thanks for sharing that. So what made you want to go down this path as a career? You mentioned how your time at Smith College was really influential towards that decision too. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually received doula training my first year of college,
Mm.
and a doula is someone that provides prenatal care. They don't have a medical degree, but they provide support. So they'll provide informational support, physical support, emotional support. And usually they're that person who is there with you while you're delivering and while you're in labor. And they help you provide comfort measures and just that continuous support, because we know from a lot of studies have been done showing that doulas can really improve a mother's experience during labor and after birth.
Hmm.
And it makes sense, I think, logically, to have someone who's there for you while you're in pain and having a baby.
Yeah, and someone that like knows about like more about what you're going through, especially if like you're a new mom and like
Mhm.
your first time, you've no idea what's going
Yeah,
to happen. It's nice to have someone that's like a calming presence.
exactly. Yeah. And even some people say, oh, well, your partner's there, your husband, wife, whoever's there, but they're honestly probably equally as scared and frightened as you are. So they also might not always be the most help, like in knowing what's going to happen. So
Hmm.
even having a doula to support your partner, like the non-birthing person, can actually
Hmm.
be really helpful too.
Yeah, that's
Um,
that's so interesting. So like you got it your first year, you said, at Smith. Did you always know that you wanted to be a nurse or to work in maternal health?
I didn't. I think growing up, I knew I wanted to help women. I was really interested in like feminism. Like in high school, I was that girl that was like, yeah, feminism, it's so great. Like, empower women. And that was like my thing. But I didn't really know where to go with that. And when I got to college, I, one of my, like, I think first freshman seminars talked about like global women's health issues, and there was someone in the class who had gotten doula training in that area, like through an alum of the college. And so I was able to get that done, and that opened up a lot of doors for me, because once I had that training, I was able to go on. I went on a volunteer trip the following year to a hospital in the Dominican Republic, and I helped women while they were in labor, basically just held their hand and gave them words of encouragement and support, and was just there for them. And that was the first moment I realized I really wanted to be in that setting, to
Mhm.
be in the room with the people who are in labor and in pain, and maybe they don't have someone to help them, or maybe they're just really scared. And I really wanted to be that person, that, like you said, that calming person for
Mhm.
them.
That's amazing. I think that's so admirable, especially in countries like the DR and other um, underdeveloped countries where like maternal care and like maternal health is not even necessarily a term that they use, or like a system that they have in place in their healthcare system. So a lot of times these mothers are having birth in their homes with no one really to support and help
Mm.
them. So I think that's really admirable. And I don't know, I love that. Before we get into more about maternal health, I understand that this past year has been really difficult for everyone with COVID, but especially for healthcare workers such as yourself. And even though you may not have directly worked with COVID patients, I'm sure it still had a really strong impact on your work. So can you describe that impact and what this past year has been like for you?
Yeah, like you said, I don't really work with a lot of COVID patients just because babies, they're less likely to get it. They're just not the population that is more likely to contract it. We did have a few COVID cases, but I personally did not take care of any babies that had it. So it didn't affect me in that sense, but it did affect our hospital as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're a children's hospital, they had to stop a lot of procedures, like elective procedures. So the hospital kind of lost a lot of revenue. And so we stopped hiring like right after I got hired, actually.
Mm.
So I think for me and my coworkers, the biggest impact that has had is we have been pretty short staffed. We've just had to deal with not having enough nurses every shift. And
Mm.
so I think that's like a common issue across a lot of hospitals right now, but that's really hard, especially in an ICU setting
Mm-hmm.
where we usually have one nurse to one patient or one nurse to two patients because the patients have much higher levels of acuity. They're a lot sicker. So having fewer staff members just makes it harder for everyone because then you're kind of spread thin and you're trying to do a lot of work and take care of really critically ill patients and then not have as much support around.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's been the biggest factor and impact on us. It's also a little bit hard for me to say because I started in the middle of the pandemic, so I don't really have anything else to compare it to.
True.
Um,
So you kind
so
of just like hit the ground running.
yeah,
But it's
but
still, I just want to acknowledge that, because even though you didn't necessarily work with COVID patients, it still had an effect on like your job and you coming in and not necessarily having that sense of normalcy that you don't know any different, but like it still had
mhm.
an impact, you know. So I just wanted to take the time to say thank you for being a healthcare worker and literally diving right in the middle of the pandemic.
Thank you.
And I'm sure the parents and the babies also appreciate it as well. Um, so yeah. All right. So I want to switch back to maternal health, and um, obviously the US, or not obviously, so the United States has the highest mortality rate among developed nations, and so that means we have more mothers dying in childbirth, and unfortunately Black women are the most likely to die in childbirth. And so however, the majority of these deaths are preventable, and I know it was quite shocking for me to learn this when I did, because I was like, wait, we're in the United States, we're one of the richest countries in the world. Why are mothers dying? Period, in general, for preventable deaths, you know? So can you explain a little bit from based off of your background knowledge why this is happening and what are some of the causes of this?
Yeah, it's a really important question to ask, and it's definitely, yeah, I think one of the biggest issues of our time right now, because I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I think maternal health is just, it's so important. And you briefly mentioned like how the first year of the newborn's life is like one of the most crucial parts of their whole lives. So yeah, it's something that we definitely should be paying attention to more.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, so yeah, Black women are, I believe, 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die during pregnancy and childbirth. And it seems like obvious that the issue would be racism, but it's very complex. Like there are so many factors. It's like an umbrella, I guess, and within the umbrella of racism, um, there are so many other underlying factors. So I think one of the biggest issues is that Black women in general are more likely to have other health conditions before they even become pregnant. So there's this term that we use like called weathering. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
No.
I think it was coined in the 90s by a doctor who was studying Black women and during pregnancy, and she found that for white women, they were most fertile and most likely to be healthy during pregnancy between the ages of 20 and their early 30s. But for Black women, they're most likely to be at that point in their teenage years.
Wow.
And but that's not to say that you should be having babies when you're a
No.
teenager. What I found from that is that Black women, their bodies are starting to deteriorate much earlier than white women. So by the time they get to their 20s, their bodies are already starting to deteriorate from all the stress and the impacts of racism
Mhm.
and like that trauma, that generational trauma. So they're more Black women are more likely, I think Black people in general are more likely to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease.
Mhm.
So having heart attacks and strokes, having high blood pressure, um, having diabetes. So all of these factors, like if you already come in to being pregnant having those issues, that's going to affect your pregnancy.
Mhm.
So you already have high blood pressure, you have diabetes. Having high blood pressure during pregnancy can be really dangerous and potentially fatal. I believe Beyonce had high blood pressure while she was pregnant.
Mhm.
Uh, and so even someone like Beyonce can have those types of health issues.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just like a really that's a really prominent example of just how like even if she probably I mean I'm just assuming, but I'm assuming she has access to good medical care and doctors and
Mhm.
can afford to do that.
Yeah.
So even if someone like her on that caliber is still having health issues, like think about women who are of like lower socioeconomic status who maybe don't have access to just regular care from a doctor, maybe don't have access to like a healthy diet, can't access fresh fruits and vegetables, don't have time to exercise because they're working all the time. All these different factors are going to like lead up to when you become pregnant and then affect the status of you and your baby.
Mhm.
And so then if you already have those underlying health conditions while you're pregnant, it makes you more at risk for, like I said, I think Beyonce had preeclampsia. That's where you have high blood pressure, and that can be fatal. Or if you have diabetes, that can affect your baby. Your baby might be born too early. They might have you might have a stillbirth where they die still while in utero. A lot of different factors that could affect if the baby dies, or potentially if you have like a risk complications that could affect the mother and could kill her as well. Um, and then the other factor of racism is a lot of healthcare providers don't listen to Black women and Black moms. And I think a really good example of that is Serena Williams' pregnancy,
Mhm.
where she, I think she said she felt pain in her legs or something, and she had experienced it before. And she told the nurse that she thought she had a blood clot and she needed like heparin, a blood thinner medication, and like a CAT scan to check and see. And they didn't believe her. And I think they just said, oh, like, it's just, you're experiencing that from like your medication or something. And they just sort of brushed her off. I think it wasn't until like, I think her husband may have pushed them or something.
Mhm.
And then they checked and they saw she had multiple blood clots. And she could have died from that. And so that's really horrifying that they wouldn't listen to her. Um,
And that's Serena Williams.
Right, yeah, also another extremely prominent, famous, amazing woman. Like, I will, like, listen to anything she tells me to do.
I'd be like, I'm not going to be responsible for Serena Williams, like any health issues. Like,
Yeah. So it seems so basic, but just listening and taking the patient seriously, I think that's like a huge problem that I see also like within just my field and my experience. Um, we get a certain amount of like diversity training, when you get hired, but I feel like it's not deep enough and it doesn't challenge people enough to like really dig deep and say, okay, why don't you think this person is in pain? Is it because of their race? Is it because of like this unconscious bias that you hold?
mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are just like a few things I think that are causing maternal mortality. And it's it's just very frustrating for me to see it because I don't work directly like in the labor and delivery setting, but I do work with a lot of parents because a lot of the parents are there with their baby during my shift, and I feel like there definitely is a lot of unconscious bias that other providers hold, and it's it's really hard to unpack that and to teach people to recognize like where that might be coming from and to let go of preconceived notions they have about a family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
So
that's all of that's really interesting what you said, especially weathering, because that's a term that I didn't hear about, but like I knew in general that Black people in general were also more likely to die earlier. Um, and they were saying like racism, the effects of racism and living with it every day is probably the root cause of all of that. Um, and like you said, like racism is kind of like the big umbrella, and then that sort of like feeds into all the other issues. Um, and I think it's interesting that you're saying like Black women, the time that they should be having babies, or that they would be the most fertile to have babies, is when they're in their teen years. And my brain kept thinking like, oh, teen pregnancies and how that's a stigma towards like Black women. And it just all kind of just like clicked together. I was like, oh, that's why. Um, and I don't know. I think about this all the time because like I'm 25, I just turned 25. And I mean, I'm not in any way, shape, or form ready to have a baby. But like this is things I have to start thinking about. Um, and these are things that I do have concerns about when eventually I want to have children, because that's something I do want for myself. Um, and just like not being believed, really have to considering who is my provider and hoping it's a person of color, particularly like Black women, a Black doctor in general. But also this kind of ties into my next question. Like one of the reasons why this is an issue is because there's an undersupply of maternal care providers, especially midwives, and especially those that are of color. Um, so you've told me that you are an aspiring midwife, and you've mentioned earlier that you've had doula training as well. So can you talk about more about what midwives do and why they're so important, and how that differs from a doula?
mhm. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the point about how there is a shortage of healthcare providers, especially within like reproductive health care and gynecological care,
Mm-hmm.
because midwives can really bridge that gap. And so that's why I'm super like passionate about midwifery. um, but yeah, so midwife is a healthcare provider. They can provide gynecological care to like young women and girls all the way up through like menopausal age, and specifically certified nurse midwives can provide that care. There are also certified professional midwives, and they are not nurses, but they can provide care during your pregnancy and postpartum.
Mm.
But as a whole, the midwife generally is that person who's providing the prenatal care. They're assessing you, making sure you're healthy and okay during pregnancy, and then they're present for your delivery and help you give birth to the baby, and then can help you as well briefly postpartum for like a couple weeks after. And so, yeah, that's what I want to do, is become a certified nurse midwife.
Mm.
And the great thing about certified nurse midwives is that they can also provide a range of care. So you can also treat young people who um, maybe they need like STI testing, pap smears, contraception. I mean, not just young people, like anyone,
Yeah.
can start, can start treating like young girls and women. And um, I feel like midwives provide a lot of really important education about your sexual health and well-being just in general, and nutrition, and there are all types of um, health issues that women experience, and midwives can oftentimes like be that person you can go to. If not, they can refer you to specialists. I see a midwife personally for my gynecological care, and it's funny because usually when I go in, it's a lot of pregnant women, and then it's just me, but the office. But um, I really am drawn to the midwifery model of care because I feel like, specifically nurse midwives, as nurses, you're encouraged to be more holistic and look at the body as a whole and think about all the various factors into play, not just like what is the disease. Because I feel like doctors, they're very disease based, so they're trained to know exactly what's going on like within your body and within like the molecules and the like how the organs work and all those things. And as a nurse, you have to know that as well, but it's just a more deeper level. And so I feel like with midwives, you're also trained to take into account social factors and like what your emotional well-being and mental well-being is in that state. And so I think that's why they're so important to be brought into the healthcare system and encouraged, like for patients to see midwives, not just seen an obstetrician gynecologist. um, and like you said about the gap in care, midwives, um, it's a little bit, I don't want to say if it's easier to become midwife, but you don't have to go to as many years of training as a doctor does. So it can be a little bit easier to get more people to go into that field because they don't have to go to schools for long. It's more appealing. So you draw in more people um, who maybe don't want to make that commitment to be a doctor, but they still want to provide that care level of care. And so we could be training more nurse midwives like on a much like higher level than we currently are, and that could really help provide that support and gap.
Yeah. And I think too, I feel like that is not necessarily a career path that is advertised well when you're young. And also just everything that you were saying about midwives and doulas, like we're not told this in school when we have health or sex ed. We're not told about any of this. It's usually when we get to college or after, and we just happen to like I said, I kind of just happened to fall into this. I was never taught any of this by a professor or a teacher or a trained professional, none of that. So I think that's really interesting because like also when we talk about access and the gap, a lot of times these are in areas where like either low income or rural areas that don't have access to either a hospital, or like the hospital's like an hour away, but when you're giving birth, like that may not be an option.
Time.
um, or you don't have access to transportation to actually get there. And so having more midwives in those areas that can provide that care and support them, so that in case when they do go into birth, there's at least someone nearby that can help them through that and after birth as well. I think that's so crucial and so important. So I commend you for Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, no, those are all like also very important points to note is in rural areas, can you even get to a hospital in time? Is there someone close by if it's an emergency? That's like, yeah, that is also a huge issue. And I know that there are programs trying to recruit nurse and midwives to live in rural areas, but it's very hard. It's very hard to get people to go out there and do that type of work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think that's also because you had mentioned talking about the difference between a midwife and a doula. And this is also where doulas can also come into play. Doulas don't have a medical background, but they can still provide that emotional, physical support. And it can be really helpful to have a doula checking in with these women before they even have their baby,
Mm-hmm.
just to make sure they're right on track and give them advice about nutrition and wellness and just making sure they're okay. And sometimes doulas also are encouraged to be advocates for the patient, for the client. And so having a doula with you can be really important to have, especially if you are in labor and you're in pain, you might not necessarily be able to express yourself fully. And so having a doula there who knows you and knows what you want for your birth and for yourself, they can also like really uplift your voice. So those are also like important to have in conjunction along with midwives. Because yeah, pregnancy, like you really need so much support. Everyone needs to chip in and help.
Yeah. And so I guess, how do you get a doula? How do you get a midwife?
Yeah, really great questions. Yeah, I feel like for me, there's a stereotype that doulas are just like people who go help like really rich white women like in the cities. Like that was for me coming into this world. That's kind of what I perceived doulas as. But it's slowly changing, and so usually there are like doula organizations where there will be multiple doulas and you can ask for one. So I would encourage people to like just look up doulas in your area because usually there's some sort of like collective or cohort. But if there isn't one, sometimes hospitals will provide them for free. So I know like in Delaware, like Christiana Hospital, they have a few set doulas. Like I looked it up on their webpage, like they list a few that are approved to come in during COVID.
Mm.
Um, and I know like at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, they also partner with a doula organization. And so they'll provide doulas for you for free, for no cost.
Nice.
So it's definitely a good idea to look into your hospital and see if they even offer that. But then you can also find it through like if you go to see a midwife. A lot of times midwives, they work at birth centers or they work just in regular office settings, maybe in conjunction with other OBGYNs. So I feel like there's usually like one or two midwives at a lot of hospital practices. So like for example, when I was starting off, I'm also 25. When I was like went in to get my first pap smear like a couple years ago,
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at the just like this women's healthcare office, and I was scrolling through to see what the providers were, and I saw there were some midwives. So when they asked like if I had a preference who to be seen by, I said, oh, like could I be seen by one of the midwives? And they said, yeah, no problem. So you can always request that. Uh, but I think it's just important, yeah, for people to know that's even an option,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I didn't really know what midwives could do until I got to college. I had no idea I could even see one as a
Mm-hmm.
non-pregnant person.
And I definitely think there's a stigma towards midwives and doulas. Um, whether or not that's like explicitly stated, it feels like, because especially doulas, because they don't necessarily have a medical background, there's the stigma of like, oh, you're putting like your baby in the hands of a random person that doesn't know what they're doing. But these people are like pretty well trained. Like it's not like a
Mm-hmm.
simple like it's not to the level of a doctor, like you said, But so like nurses aren't to the level of doctors either, and neither are midwives. You know what I'm saying? Like doctors have years and years of training because they may do surgeries, they may do like doulas are not going to do surgery on you. It's okay. Like you're going to be fine. So on average, do you know how much training like midwives and doulas have? And also like what are the sort of stigmas towards those professions?
Yeah, so there really is so much stigma. I think in the US, midwives only attend around 8 or 9% of births, which
Mm.
is really not that many.
Mm-mm.
Um, and most of them are in the hospital. And like, I think it's like, I don't know the actual statistic, but it's very, very low, the number of women who give birth at home or in birth centers. And yeah, I think a huge reason why there's a stigma is because, yeah, midwives are seen as just like they historically doctors have sort of categorized them almost like practicing like witchcraft, like
Yeah.
which is kind of weird, but it's like, oh, like you're just like, you're not using surgical intervention, like you're using like, I don't know, music and herbs and stuff, and like it people think that it's very like kind of hippie-ish.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the important distinction to make is that midwives, they provide care to women who are at low risk.
Mm.
So, like you said, a midwife or doula, they're not going to be performing surgery, and they're not trained for that. That's not their intention. Is they're not there to provide the highest like level of care to like the most critically ill patients.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why people get scared of midwives, because they think, oh, if I have a midwife, what if something goes wrong and my baby or I die? I don't want to see a midwife. I just want to see a doctor. And I 100% understand that fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought those things as well before I came into it. But like I said, I think it's important to emphasize that midwives take care of patients that are low risk, that are going to have a healthy pregnancy. And going off of that, if you are healthy and you are low risk, you probably don't need to be in a hospital. Obviously, like you need to check with your doctors and your healthcare providers to make sure. But women have been giving birth at home for hundreds and hundreds
A
of
lot
years.
longer than hospitals.
Yeah, and midwives have been those people that have always been taking care of them.
Mm-hmm.
And most people had midwives up until like when doctors and hospitals became much more prominent in like the early 1900s. So midwives have been around for a very, very long time, and especially midwives of color.
Mm-hmm.
I think that also plays into the stigma, is that if you are like a Black midwife or a woman of color, you're not as like educated as a doctor. Um, that's definitely not true.
Mm-mm.
So to become a certified nurse midwife, you have to have your bachelor's in nursing. So that's usually like a 4-year program. And then you also have to have your master's of science in nursing, and that's a 2-year program. And so, and then some women also will even go on, or not women, I'm also generalizing. It's just a lot of women who are midwives, but there can
Mm-hmm.
definitely be more midwives. But a
Mm-hmm.
lot of midwives can also go on and will get their doctorate. There have been more programs that are actually pushing midwives to do that. So that's also, I don't know exactly how many years that is, but that's more additional years of training. And doulas, like I said, they don't have medical background, but they're not there to provide you with medical advice. They're just there. They can help you make referrals and guide you in the right direction, connect you with people. But like I said, they're mostly there to provide that support. So usually doulas have to complete like a couple workshops over the course of a few days, and then attend childbirth classes, breastfeeding classes, and usually you are encouraged to shadow and attend other births before you start attending your own. Um, So that can be really helpful. Just even having just seen one or two births gives you a lot more knowledge and experience going into one than
Mm-hmm.
someone who's had a baby. Um, so yeah, I think again, just like the important thing to emphasize is that like a doula is not providing medical advice, and then midwives, they're not providing like the highest tier of care.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you really have to put that into context when you're thinking about what kind of provider you want, and like what level you're comfortable with.
Yeah. And just overall, like you're in good hands
Yeah,
with a
yeah.
doula, a midwife, a doctor.
Mhm.
Um, you're in good hands. And I love what you said in term earlier about doulas being also advocates. So that I think is so important for people that like mothers, people that are pregnant, to have that advocate that speaks up for them. And especially if the doctor, like, you know, like for Serena Williams, isn't necessarily believing them when they
Mhm.
say, I think something's wrong. So
Yeah.
having a doula that's like, I've been around her or I've been around them and this is different. They've never complained about this till now. You should check it. Um,
Right.
and I always say, this is like an advice that I've learned. I don't know if it's right. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Is whether or not this is, if you're pregnant or you're not, and you say that there's something wrong and you want something to be tested. And if the doctor says no, you can ask them to put that on your medical record that they said no. Um, just in case, God forbid, something
Mhm.
happens, then like there's been a couple like stories where people have died. They said something was wrong and they asked their doctor, and the doctor said no. And because they had it on their medical record, their family was able to receive like some sort of compensation legally. Um, so that's just something that I've learned that I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, you definitely do that. It really is important to advocate for yourself, because I feel like there are so many power dynamics that you don't talk about between a patient and a healthcare provider, and it can be scary going in as a patient and saying something to a doctor, and then if they say no, you're like, well, they're the experts, so I guess I'm wrong. I can't, and then you start to doubt yourself and question yourself. But they, like, they work for you, so they should be listening to you and taking you seriously. And you know your body best. I think that's what's so important. I always like try to reemphasize to patients is like, how you're feeling, and so you have to be the one to voice that and vocalize that, because even if I'm taking care of a patient, I can only see what I can see. I can't tell how you're feeling internally, and there's a lot of times issues that are happening and you just don't see it. um, so yeah, I think that's really good advice, because you never know, and it's better to be safe than sorry.
Yep. True, true. Um, so moving forward, I have one good friend who, well, a lot of my friends are really into public health, but my one good friend, Casey, she was so excited when I told her I was interviewing you because she loves like maternal health. She has her MPH. And so this question she came up with. So I wanted to give her a little shout out. But in your job, you see the side of babies who are high risk. And so I would love to know, or she wanted to know what your thoughts were on the gaps in our healthcare system when it comes to supporting new moms, especially those with babies that have a lot of needs after their babies are born. Um, and just the question that she had was, how could we be caring for mothers and babies better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's definitely something I think a lot about, because, yeah, like I said, I'm working with these babies. So I'm seeing a lot of these babies at their worst. Um, and yeah, there are so many things we could do. I guess starting from like the beginning, um, in general, we need to be providing a lot of education to women and girls and people before they even become pregnant. So they're aware, just aware of like even how you get pregnant, or like contraception. I think it's really, really important to be providing contraception to all people to prevent pregnancy, because it's really difficult. Like I'll see a lot of patients that were maybe like an unplanned pregnancy or a mom didn't know they were pregnant. And if you don't know you're pregnant, then you might be doing things like drinking alcohol or smoking or eating things that are not necessarily healthy for you. So that will affect your baby. So just like before you even become pregnant, we need to be providing education on family planning and sexual health, providing contraception, teaching people about how to have healthy, safe, consensual sex. All those things are just really important to know before you even start having babies.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're pregnant, we have to, again, it's a lot of it's just education, and so teaching people about what to expect, because um, if you don't know anything at all and then you just go into the hospital and you have your baby, that's going to be really shocking, because you're going to be in a lot of pain. If you don't know how much pain you're going to be in, that can be really jarring, and you might just go along with whatever the medical team says, even like you might not question it, even if you think it might not be the best fit for you. And so it's really important to teach people what to expect and to know how to advocate for themselves in those settings, so they're aware of what the progression of care could be. Because if you go in to have a baby and then suddenly they're like, you need a C-section, and you don't know anything about that, and they give you like a 1-minute spiel about it, that can be really traumatizing. um, and so that sort of like a lot of trauma can happen, not to scare people from having babies, but there can be trauma that happens in the delivery room if you have a C-section you didn't know, or say you're in labor for a really long time and it's a lot of pain. um, and that trauma can affect you later down the road. So then after you've had your baby, it's really important to get it to check in with your midwife or doctor after a few days after you've had your baby, because a lot of times women will still continue to bleed even after they have their baby. Usually it's not a lot, it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start having like blood clots that are like larger than like a fruit or something, the size of a fruit, um, then that can be really concerning and you might be bleeding out. And so I think that's where in the US we have a huge that huge gap where we're not always checking in with moms. There's not like a standard policy for someone to go like check on you, and not just like go in for a checkup, but like to go homes, because if you've just had a C-section or you just had a baby, you're not going to size and stuff, but you want to take it easy. You might not be able to get to your doctor's appointment in time. I know in certain parts of Europe, there will be somebody that goes to your home and checks on you like a week after you've had your baby.
Mm.
And so that's super important, just to have someone just to like be in your home and like see you, see the baby, make sure you're alive and okay, and then answer all your questions you have. So being able to just check with women after, or pregnant people after they've had their baby, to make sure they're okay, just like can reduce the rate of maternal mortality, because a lot of the deaths don't just happen during pregnancy or during birth, they can happen after.
Mm.
um, so like there can be you can hemorrhage out. I think like you can have like a cardiovascular complication like a heart attack or stroke. And then postpartum depression and mental health also plays a really big factor.
Mm-hmm.
So postpartum depression, it's something that affects a lot of people. And there's different ranges. There's like baby blues, where that's not as severe, or maybe it only lasts for like a couple days to a couple weeks. But then there's really severe postpartum depression where it can last for months and months, and that can affect you. And um, unfortunately, like sometimes women will commit suicide from that. um, the very very extreme cases are where like they might actually harm the baby. And so that's why it's so important to have someone checking in with you after. And just having that continuous support can show up in many ways. So like having like a mom's group, a breastfeeding support group. Breastfeeding is a whole other issue, like a whole other world,
Mm-hmm.
that requires so much support and education. And it just really helps to have, it can really help have to have other mothers who are going through the same thing, and you can share tips and advice and know that you're not going through this alone, because it's can be a very painful process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and then providing support like in the forms of childcare and daycare. I think a lot of a lot of moms have to work and they have to go back to work really soon. So if employers can provide that option, or if you can have more accessible, affordable childcare, that can make a huge difference, because it can be very, very expensive to send your baby to daycare,
Mm-hmm.
especially like one that is safe and is that you trust. Um, and then I think paid parental leave is also a huge, huge thing that we should be doing in the US.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We don't have, I don't believe there's any sort of like federal policy for paid leave. Certain states have their own policies, but
Mm-hmm.
in general, we have a really, really poor model for paid leave compared to certain countries. Um, I was looking it up earlier just to see, and the country Estonia, they provide a year and a half of paid leave,
That's
which
wild.
is just incredible. It just blows my mind that people even
Imagine
do
if you could
that.
just take a
But
year off. Wow. I mean, it's not even like taking a year off though, because you're still a parent. Like
it's
you're
really
working, you're just working at home.
hard.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that I think is one of the biggest things we could do, because having to come back to work so soon after you had your baby, not only is that just like emotionally difficult and taxing, but then like you're not providing your baby with that constant care that it needs. And babies really do need to be like held all the time and loved, and they just need that attention, and that can really impact their growth in the long term. So yeah, if we could have paid parental leave, that would make a huge world of a difference.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And so if you're listening, I always tell, like, I've talked to my audience about ways in which they can like participate in our democracy, and like one of the ways in which they can do that is calling their representative and or sending them a letter or an email, telling them to like support certain policies. And so definitely pushing for them to also provide like a national paid leave system so that mothers can actually, and people that like fathers too, because paternal care also matters a lot as well. And just whoever who has a baby, whether or not they gave birth to the child or not, they deserve time um, to get adjusted to this new person, and making sure that they survive their first year, because that's really important, as you said.
Yeah, it's such an important investment, and I think it's hard for people to think of it long term, because you just think, oh, like immediately, well, you need to get back in the workforce to, give back to the economy and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
even just like a year and a half might seem like a long time, but for a person's lifetime, like that is so monumental. And like being able to intervene so young and make sure that baby has both parents or whoever their guardians are with them, and being able to take care of them, and um, you know give cook for them and bring them to the park and bring them outside and help them with their development, like that will impact them for the rest of their lives. That'll impact like their health and their well-being. And if we can have healthy babies, then we'll have healthy adults, and we won't have as big of a strain on our healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
um, it just There's so many reasons why it's so important to invest in our babies and in our parents, and that really should be taken a higher priority. But that's also another issue within the U.S. healthcare system, is we provide a lot of what we call like tertiary care, where we intervene when someone's already sick, and that like
Mm-hmm.
they've already reached a point where they're really sick, and now we just have to abate, like heal the symptoms. But we should be providing a lot of primary care, which is like keeping people healthy before they get sick, and anticipating problems down the line, so intervening before that can even happen.
Mm-hmm.
We really should be investing more in that, but unfortunately, we don't really do that much here in our
Yeah.
country.
And I mean, I feel like because of this past year, a lot of us are realizing that not just taking time to prevent pandemics from spreading, but also like a lot of people died for a lot of various reasons. Some people were healthy, but a lot of people did have certain conditions or health issues that they didn't even know that they had, which led to them getting COVID. Um, so yeah, all of it's connected. Like none of this is one separate issue, and we could talk about these issues forever. I would love, I was already, like I said, my friend Casey was sending me all these questions, and I kind of like tried to take what one I felt was also most interesting for right now. But we were like, we could talk about this forever. And like you were saying, like breastfeeding's a whole separate issue. Like not separate, but like that is an issue we could talk about for a while. Like I we could talk about this forever. And maybe hopefully down the line we could do like a part 2, or like asking the audience for their questions, because I'm sure they're all curious now. But to end this, before we get into the more fun questions, on a brighter note, what do you love most about maternal newborn health and just your field in general?
Well, just working in the NICU, I just love being around the babies because I mean, some people don't like babies, but I love them. They're so cute. And so it's just a lot of fun to be able to just work with them and like cuddle them and just like hold their hand. I mean, that just baseline, like I just love that part about my job, getting to
Mm-hmm.
be around the little babies all the time. Um, but I think what I really love about this field is just being able to have a positive impact on a mom and the baby and that family. Because for me, I feel like I can have the strongest impact at this point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just very rewarding, knowing that I can educate a mom on how to breastfeed her baby and just showing a dad how to swaddle the baby in the blanket, teaching them how to give them a bath and what they can eat. That it's just a lot of fun for me to be able to teach parents that as well and see them learning and realizing, oh yeah, like I can do this, and I'm about to like raise this little human. um it's so exciting to me because there's just so many possibilities. Like sometimes I like to look at my patients and think, okay, one day this baby could be, I don't know, some like prominent educator or politician, or you never know, you just never
Mm-hmm.
know what that baby could do. And so that world of possibilities is just, it's very exciting and it energizes me and it just gives me a lot of hope.
Well, I'm glad that there's a Cecelia, and like all these parents get to have you um, to care for them and to watch over their babies. So again, thank you for that. And to move forward, to close out, we're gonna do a little like sort of fun questions, like speed round. It's not really speed round. It's just more fun. So basically, I ask you a question about yourself, just so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, because you are also a person outside of your role and your position. And just don't think too much about it. Don't think too hard. And that's pretty much it. Are you ready?
I think so.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier that you love dancing. And like I said, I'm also a dancer. So I would love to know, like, what is your favorite style of dance?
I love all dance, but I really love house dancing,
Mm.
um, pop. That's been my favorite right now. But I also love break dancing because I've been taking breaking classes,
Oh, that's so cool.
and yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's I can't do a lot of the moves yet because I'm not quite strong enough. I'm working on building my muscle strength, but it's a lot of fun to be able to do the things that like I you see like in videos and in social
Mm-hmm.
media. Um, and I also love modern and contemporary and ballet because that's what I grew up doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love everything.
I'm the same way. I grew up doing ballet, jazz, and hip hop. I definitely would say like hip hop and sort of Afro Caribbean dance is like my favorite, because my family's from Haiti. So like the Caribbean vibes, Haitian, like compa, like that's like, we all love that. It's funny that you mentioned breakdancing because when I did hip hop, I had to do like one break dance pose, like the one where like your head's on the ground and your legs are above you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't ask me to do that again. I was like, I don't remember how old I was. I think I was in middle school or something. But I just know like people listening, people that are my friends will be like, oh, Dabney, can you do it? No, because I'm not the same like size as I was when I was a child. And I could do that easily. But it's a lot harder than it looks. There is, like you were saying, muscle strength, like your arms, like to be able to like hold your whole body weight.
It's hard, yeah. The teacher, he told me every week, he's like, Cecelia, you need to do your push-ups. And he told me I need to do like 20 push-ups a day. And I'm like, I can't. I'm working on it, I'm building up to it.
Mm-hmm. Push-ups suck too, so I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I don't blame you. And the next question, I also heard you love K-pop.
Yeah.
Jess told me a lot. You're probably like, so who's your favorite group, and do you have any song recommendations?
I really love Mamamoo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're this like four person girl K-pop group, and I just feel like they're just really cool. They give off a very cool image, and because within K-pop, a lot of the girl groups are like a lot more like kind of like feminine and girly
Mm-hmm.
and like cutesy. But I feel like Mamamoo, like they're a little bit more edgy, and so I
Mm.
really like that about them. And let's see, of their songs, there's so many. I like their song Dinga and Hip. Those are probably like their like more popular songs right now.
Okay, so
Um,
Mamamoo,
Mamamoo,
Dinga, Hip.
Hip, and then within the group there's I don't know, she's not the leader, but she's one of the more prominent members of the group. Her name is Hwasa, and she has a lot of really great songs out as well. So I would also recommend looking into her, just like her individual songs.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That I thank you for that because I feel like a lot of times with K-pop groups, people just focus on like BTS and
Oh, yeah.
like the big ones. But there's a lot. There's a lot of groups,
So
and so
many.
there you can always find one that fits your style. Um,
Yes.
Next question I have for you. I've heard you've traveled a bit. So I would love to know like what was a place you've traveled to that you enjoyed unexpectedly?
Hmm. Nowhere recently.
Obviously.
um, but let's see. I went to Malaysia because my dad was born and grew up there.
Mm,
We went there. That was a long time ago when I was a teenager. Um, but it was really beautiful. I didn't know what to expect at all.
mhm.
It's really, really hot, so I didn't really like that part of it because it's right by the equator,
Mm,
so very hot and humid. Um, but the food there is just so amazing and fresh. And I remember just walking down the street with my family, and we passed by this stand, and they were selling juice, and it was literally just like fresh fruit juice.
mm.
And so I got this watermelon drink, and he literally just like took watermelon, just like squeezed it, and that was my drink. And it just sounds like, oh, you're just eating watermelon, but it actually like
It's
tastes so different in drink form. And ever since then, like my family, we just like make our own watermelon juice now because it was just so refreshing.
Mhm,
Um, I really love food, so I feel like that's like the first thing that came to my mind when I thought about traveling.
mhm. I feel like
um,
that's really food is like the main bit of traveling.
I mean, it really can really educate you about the culture and the people just like by the food that they make.
Mhm.
We also had fresh coconut milk, or I don't know, water. Like
The
we
like
literally drank
the
from,
mhm.
yeah. And like we were in Singapore as well because Singapore is like right there next to Malaysia, and they have the most amazing food stands. just like incredible noodles and rice dishes and seafood. It's just, there's so many different things. I had the spiciest crabs I've ever had in my life there. I cried a little because it was so spicy.
That's so
um,
funny.
but yeah, I think about the food a lot still, even though it's been like 10 years since I went there. So I feel like that was a really great experience.
And where, like post pandemic, when you're not as busy, hopefully, what would be like your next travel destination?
I really want to go to South Korea. Like I mentioned earlier, I am Korean, and I've never been to Korea, so I'd really love to be able to visit
Hmm.
places where my family lived, and just be able to reconnect with that part of my heritage. Because my grandmother, she was from Korea, and she passed away about 5 years ago, and I feel like being able to go back and visit would just help me feel more closer to her and better understand like her life. So that's definitely like top of my list.
Hmm.
um, Korea, maybe Australia or New Zealand. I've always
Yeah.
wanted to go there too.
um, I definitely understand the whole like going back to basically your roots because I've never been to Haiti yet. So I definitely want to go. So I hope you get to do that sooner than later
Yeah.
if people get vaccinated and get their lives together so we can travel again. And
Please.
also the rest of the world can get vaccinated as well. Um, and then my last question for you is how do you self care and relax?
That's such a good question because I feel like I've had to rethink how I do self care within the last year.
Mm,
Part of it just because my work schedule is so hectic. I work night shift, so I always work 7 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. And I don't know if you've ever worked an overnight shift, but it's very
no.
hard.
No,
I wouldn't recommend it.
I'll try to avoid that probably for life.
You should. So it's been very taxing on my body. So I've had to like reevaluate how I really like take care of myself. So just like baseline, I need to sleep a lot. Just like
Mm,
prioritizing sleep. I will probably take a nap later today.
mm,
Um,
love
but
that.
yeah, besides sleeping, I mean, as you know, I love to dance, and I think that's just my biggest de-stressor is being able to take a dance class, go to the studio, and just forget about everything.
Hmm.
It just can really help me get my mind off of things. So that's definitely my go-to.
Nice.
And I also really like to read, and so I've been trying to read a lot more. And
Any
and
book
I
recommendations?
Yeah, well, I'm reading right now. I'm reading "On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous" by Ocean Vuong. He's a poet, but this is, I believe, his first novel, and it's really good. He's Vietnamese, so it's about him and his mother and being refugees from the war
Hmm.
and growing up in the U.S. So it's very, very emotional, but very, very well written.
Nice, nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I learned so much talking from you. And like I said, we could go on for hours about maternal health because my brain was like, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? But I definitely appreciate you coming on and teaching me, teaching the rest of us more about maternal health and what we can do to be there for those that are pregnant or just trying to have children in any way possible and how we can advocate for those people as well. So thank you so much for coming on, Cecelia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dabney. This is really great. Yeah,
I could talk about this forever, and I'm already thinking of ways where we could talk about maternal health more, whether that's a part 2 episode or an Insta Live where y'all can ask more questions. Basically, let me know what y'all think. If you want a part 2 or an Insta Live, let me know. I'll probably put a poll up on my Instagram stories or on my stories in general this week. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. But for this week's Dabney Debrief, um, we talked a lot about how this information about maternal health and reproductive health we don't know or don't learn in school. And a lot of you may be listening and learning new things right now. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm someone that had a little bit of background knowledge on maternal health, and I learned so much from Cecelia. And so my reflection is simple this week because I don't want to overwhelm you. Um, and I kind of just want you to like sit and rest with this information and maybe listen back, take notes, whatever you need to do in your learning and your growing. But my reflection to you is, what is one thing you learned, or what is one thing that you did learn that you want to dig deeper into? And there's a call to action piece with this as well. I want y'all to tell one person what you learned about maternal health that you didn't know before. Again, this information a lot of people don't know, and both again, this is information a lot of people don't know or don't have everyday knowledge about. And so let's spread the wealth, I guess, spread the knowledge, this wealth of knowledge that you're learning from this episode to those that we know. And so, yeah, that's it for this week. And I'll see y'all next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For links and resources, check out the episode notes. If you liked what you heard, help your girl out by leaving a 5-star rating and a review. For more content and updates, follow the show's Insta at the Uplift_podcast. And spread the word by telling your friends and sharing on social media. Subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. For any questions or business inquiries, you can email me at theupliftpodcast1@gmail.com. This was The Uplift with Dabney Brice. See you next time.